All right. Well, from here on out, Song to the Great Lakes followers, I am very happy and pleased to bring you again today another interview guest. I first want to give thanks to Brother Rick Mixter for introducing us and opening the door for the one and only Wayne Lusardi. So, everybody, would you please give Wayne a warm welcome? And, Wayne, would you do us the honor of introducing yourself to us?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here. Thanks, Rick, for hooking us up. I'm Wayne Lusardi. I'm the state of Michigan's Maritime Archeologist, and I have been so since 2002. I'm stationed in Alpena, which is here, as everybody knows, Michigan maps, at Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary and Underwater Preserve, which is one of about 14 marine protected areas in the Great Lakes. This one is jointly managed by the state of Michigan and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA's Marine Sanctuary Program. There are a lot of underwater preserves across the state, and it is my responsibility to help to look for shipwrecks and other submerged cultural resources, to study them, to document them, and then to take whatever action is necessary to help preserve them and protect them for future generations. And we always think of Michigan as the mitten state, because it literally looks like two mittens. But in reality, about 40% of the state is underwater in the Great Lakes. And consequently, there are tons of archaeological potential, historic, cultural, and submerged resources, the most iconic of which are shipwrecks. We have about 850 or so right here in Michigan that we know of. There are probably 500 or 600 more that will be found in Michigan waters. And we know they went down based on historic reports of those accidents, but they haven't yet been found and identified. So there's a lot of shipwrecks. There's a lot of maritime infrastructure, the docks and piers and wharves and lighthouses and aids to navigation and things like that supported the commercial shipping industry for the last several hundreds of years. We have paleo landscapes, places where people hunted and followed caribou across the what is now the lake bottom 7 to 8,000 years ago, and now that's all inundated, and we're finding sites that are many thousands of years old that are in over 100 feet of water now in these flooded sort of environments that include submerged forests and other things. And then, of course, we have airplanes. Lots of aircraft have been dropping into the lakes since the 1870s with hydrogen and hot air balloons. And it carried on through biplanes and monoplanes and jet aircraft, civilian, commercial, military, rockets. Even a Russian Sputnik is in Lakes, Michigan. So lots and lots of archaeological potential. And because of the fresh, cold waters, we get pretty amazing preservation for some of these materials, particularly the organic things like wood. So it's an amazing career to be up here, to be on the top of the food chain. Half of my career was in the ocean, and you always had to worry about other kinds of things, critters that don't like people in their space, for example, and you don't have that here. So it's kind of a relatively easy environment to work in and to dive in. It's cold, but that is good because it helps to preserve these a little bit better than a marine environment that's full of salt and warmer and organisms that like to eat wood, for example. And so it is very unique, the ability to study these kinds of underwater sites in the Great Lakes. And it's just been a great honor to do that.
Yeah, no, I'm just impressed, and I've only been doing this for about a year or so, but, like, my love for all of that started when I was 10 years old, just learning
Yeah,
like, you and I were talking about, like, the Fitz was a gateway into all of that, and then I'm like, "Wait, there's more than just the Fitz, there's Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario as well that got all these, shipwrecks that go back how many hundreds of years?" Just
yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And, if we just look at like the introduction of European vessels in the 1600s and carry on through date, they're probably better than 10,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, and, when all are found. And I think lots of them will be found. We have now the technology and the mandate to map the entirety of the Great Lakes in very high resolution. And so it wouldn't surprise me if 1,000 new shipwrecks are found over the next decade or so. So there's a lot to see. There's great potential to study these resources. A lot of them are unique, one of a kind craft, especially the pre early 20th century. Even if they came out of the same yards, they're different. They're handcrafted, so they're always going to be unique. And it's pretty amazing to be able to study the people, the technologies that were utilized in the past, and the reasons why these wrecks are on the lake bottom now.
No, it's I love all of that. So how involved then you at least how many wrecks have you found or how many like when you go out kind of describe to me like how's that go for finding some of these? Like what's some good some
Yeah,
findings?
so there's a lot of ways of finding wrecks, and there are a lot of folks that do that. And there are government agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, like NOAA, like Coast Survey. Like there are academic institutions that go out and look for wrecks. There are private individuals. There is law enforcement. There are a whole lot of people now that have the ability to go out and search for shipwrecks and airplane wrecks and other kinds of submerged archaeological sites. And so they're being found more and more and more. A couple of decades ago when I started diving in the Great Lakes in the 1980s. So it's just over 40 years now. And I've seen a lot of change to those wreck sites because of invasive mussels, because of overuse recreationally to some of them, that sort of thing. But there's so much more technology now that's available to the layperson to go out and look for these. The average fish finder now, a hummingbird, is way more complicated and accurate than $100,000 side scan sonar unit was 30 years ago. So it's easier for people to find. Now, the flip side of that is that the wrecks are older, they're a little bit more degraded through natural processes, and they're significantly more covered in quagga and zebra mussels, especially here in the lower lakes. Um, but so there are regular discoveries, almost, I won't say monthly, but certainly seasonally. There are always new discoveries across the Great Lakes. And that includes other kinds of archaeological sites like aircraft, like paleo landscapes, like these sort of infrastructure things that we were talking about. Sometimes I go out and actually do survey. We do it one of two ways. We're either covering an area that we just need to cover because we haven't been out there before, or we're covering an area because we're specifically looking for something. And, like there might be a missing airplane, it might be a missing wreck site in that area. And the best historic information that we get puts us in that certain spot. And so we conduct survey there. Other times we just happen across things and then try to figure out what they are and what they may be.
That's what I was gonna ask, like, have you ever had instances where you thought you knew where and what you were looking for, but then it turns out it was in a completely different area? I'm sure you've had that, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So if it was easy, everybody would be doing it, right? And they've all been found by now. And so there's still a challenge to it all. And a lot of it is based on historic information and how much archival research and library research you do ahead of time, how many reports you get, and how narrowed down you can make that search area. I like to call it shrinking a lake. You can't just, oh, I'm gonna go look for whatever, the griffin, and just jump in Lake Huron and swim around and hope to find it. That's not an effective way of doing search, right? So you have to do a lot of research ahead of time in the library, in the archives, online now, and figure out the best likelihood of a vessel being in that area. And then you have to mobilize assets and raise funds and that kind of thing, and then go out and look. And even after all of that, the chances of finding things are sometimes pretty slim, just depending. Sometimes you get really good intel on something. An airplane might be flying out of Alpena and it crashes out by Thunder Bay Island 2 miles northeast of the lighthouse. So that's a pretty good location based on Coast Guard reports or eyewitness reports or whatever. Other times, an airplane might be flying from Chicago to Buffalo and just doesn't show up. And so, where do you even start to look for that aircraft? So you really have to try to do as much ahead of time preparation before you get on the lake, and that can be very challenging. I found things in areas that I wasn't looking for them, and all of a sudden there it is. And I've searched areas very heavily, swearing that it's going to be there, and it's not there. So you just never know. You never know when the lake is going to give up its secrets.
It's like a different type of fishing. I enjoy every year going out to Bear Lake on Manistee, and we're just fishing for bass and perch, and with my dad and uncles and everything. But like this is like a whole, if you think about a whole different level of aspect to that. Well,
Yeah.
what do you? So suppose you find either a new wreck or one you found in the past. How for you being with the State Department when it comes to artifacts, what do you guys so say there's still you find the wreck and like, hey, there's seems to be some significant stuff here. Do you what do you do with any of that? Or do you just leave it be or how does that work for
Yeah, it depends. I hate to call it a case by case basis, but it really is. So it really depends on the significance of those materials. It depends on the threat to those materials, either through natural processes that are going to break it, or because you want to open up a site potentially for recreational diving, that kind of thing, and you know that it's going to get anchored on or into, or it might get stolen or something like that. And so we have to evaluate that on a case by case. Every shipwreck has material culture associated with it. These boats weren't big empty hulls, they were full of stuff. And that stuff includes the equipment that ran them, the cargo, the sustenance items that kept the crew alive and happy, their personal effects, the whatever. And can you imagine like a cruise ship coming out of, Puerto Vallarta or something that sinks, and all of the stuff that might potentially be on that wreck site? And these ships were that same sort of thing, had a whole assemblage of things. And unfortunately, in the past, a lot of the material culture, the artifacts have been stolen or looted. Some of them actually, will drift off in the wrecking process. Some of them will degrade and just disappear over the years of submersion. And then others are just kind of stolen from the site, and that's unfortunate. So what we like to do is when we find a new wreck site that's not been dived before is to record everything that's on it, make sure that it's completely mapped and inventory, so that if it starts to be impacted through visitation, we know exactly what the artifacts were that were on the site, and where they were located. And it's very important to know the context of artifacts. A beer bottle from a shipwreck is just a beer bottle from a shipwreck, and it's a very highly sought after kind of collector item, right? But it's just a beer bottle. But if you know that it was packed in dunnage and it was in a crate down in the cargo hold and it was being shipped from Cleveland to Houghton for a specific saloon in 1892, or was it in the galley area of the vessel and was used for crew consumption, or was it up on the bridge and the captain was all liquored up and that's why the ship ran into another boat and sank to begin with? So it's that same beer bottle, but its context tells the story much better than it just being a single artifact. And so we really try to map things. We prefer to leave things on the bottom because they've been preserved there and they will continue to be preserved there, but on occasion things will come up. Yeah.
and then I'm sure through your process that probably leads to like a museum potentially or something like that to be displayed.
Yeah, exactly. And so all of the shipwrecks, most of the shipwrecks, most of the aircraft wrecks, and other archaeological sites that are on state of Michigan bottomlands, which extend all the way to the adjoining states like Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin, and all the way to the Canadian border. These are held in public trust and they're managed by the state of Michigan. And so you're not allowed to just take them at will. There's a permitting process, and that includes for archaeologists. We issue permits to recover select artifacts, sometimes for academic study, sometimes for museum exhibit, that sort of thing. All of the materials that are on the lake bottom, even if they're very well preserved, have to go through some kind of a conservation process, to get the water out of them. A piece of wood that looks beautiful on a shipwreck and somebody has to make a fireplace mantle out of will very soon fall apart. It'll start to check, it'll start to splinter if it's not conserved properly. So there's a process to treating these materials after they come out of the water. And we have a conservation lab here in Alpena at the Great Lakes Maritime Heritage Center. There's a smaller lab in Lansing at the Michigan History Center. And then we also have a lab in Detroit at the National Museum of the Tuskegee Airmen, where we are in the process of recovering a Tuskegee airplane from World War II out of Lake Huron. And the artifacts come to either Alpena or Detroit for treatment, and then will ultimately be exhibited in a museum in Detroit.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
that's that's perfect. I'd love for you to talk a bit on the I mean, we'll come back to shipwrecks, don't worry everybody, but I would love to talk a bit about the aircraft and planes and just whatever significance, because that's one thing I don't think maybe, at least I didn't realize, but I could be wrong. Many people don't realize, hey, there's more than just shipwrecks in the Great
And,
Lakes. Yeah.
and I started, I was contacted by a guy, about 18 or 20 years ago, that his father went down on an airplane accident in Lake Huron. And he wanted to know if we had come across the airplane that has never been found from 1966. And it got me thinking about the aviation potential, archaeological potential in the Great Lakes. So I put that in a database. When I first started working in the Great Lakes, I created a database for shipwrecks, and I had all of the known shipwrecks that we know about that have been identified, all of the potential shipwrecks that are out there. And that's the database is always constantly being updated and integrated with other information sources. But I thought, well, man, there's at least one airplane out there. I never really thought about airplanes, and so I put it in the database. And then I found out about the 140 or so Navy airplanes that went down off Chicago during the Second World War, when naval aviators were being trained to land and take off aircraft carriers. And I thought, wow, that's a lot of airplanes. I wonder how many are still in the lake, and there are quite a few. Maybe 60 to 80 of them are still in Lake Michigan. And so I put them in the database, and then I just kept on building this, and it's up to over 1,200 now. Aviation accidents in the lakes. Some of them have been recovered. Some of them have been recovered at least partially. They might be missing propellers and engines and wheels and tails and things like that. But there might still be some component of that aircraft in the lake. And again, it started in the 1870s with hydrogen and hot air balloons that were going and dropping into the lakes, and often with fatal results. And it carries on through today, obviously. So really, really interesting. The military has utilized the Great Lakes for training aviators since World War One, and that started kind of at Selfridge Field and Mount Clemens on the shores of Lake St. Clair, and airplanes started dropping into the lakes during military training exercises, and that again carries on through today. And some of them are very unique aircraft. So there's an X-2, for example, rocket plane that was jettisoned from a B-29 bomber in Lake Ontario with the loss of two crew members. There are rockets that NASA and the University of Michigan were shooting into suborbit that landed in Lake Superior that haven't yet been found. The Russian Sputnik, of course, in the 1960s off Manitowoc. And then lots and lots of Free French and Norwegian and Canadian and RAF and Tuskegee Airmen that were training here in the Great Lakes during the Second World War, and dozens of their aircraft were lost in the waters of the lakes.
Wow. That's
And,
that's
yeah,
incredible.
it's pretty wild.
I don't know about
And
you.
this is stuff I didn't know about. 20 years ago, I really didn't think about it very much.
Oh yeah. I don't know if you could get me in a hot air balloon over Lake Michigan, like getting to, my goodness, that's I wouldn't have never thought about that. Incredible.
Yeah. And some of these were pretty big airplanes. B-52 went into Lake Michigan in 1971 off Petoskey, Charlevoix area, and 9 airmen were killed in that accident. A DC-4 commercial airliner with Northwest Airlines went down in 1950 with 58 souls on board. These were big airplanes with a lot of folks that sort of went missing. Bits and pieces of them have been found, but the vast majority of the wreckage is still out there somewhere.
Well, that's one question I do occasionally like to ask. I guess not occasionally, but so suppose you guys find either aircraft or a wreck and there's still human remains aboard it. How do you guys deal with that? Because then that probably opens up a whole new line of like contacting maybe family members, I have to assume, for loved ones and stuff. How does that work?
Yeah,
Like,
so it depends on if it's a civilian, commercial, or military aircraft. The military generally does not seek historic wreck sites, even with missing folks, if they were involved in training accidents here in the United States. But they are interested, obviously, in recovering human remains if found. So there are specific laws, both state and federal laws in Michigan, that protect um, human remains and what you can and can't do with them. You can't photograph them underwater, for example. You can't disturb them, just like shipwrecks, but at an elevated level. And we get law enforcement involved very quickly. You report out to the local sheriff's department. The Michigan State Police has a marine operations unit that includes a bunch of divers that are very, very experienced in recovering aircraft and human remains from these wreck sites. For example, a plane went missing out of Mackinac Island in 2007 with two people on board. A few weeks later, one of the victims was found by the bridge in the Straits of Mackinac, and the airplane and the second victim were never found until a couple of years ago. There was a reintroduction of a sonar survey, and a group found it. The Michigan State Police went out and recovered the second victim that was right next to the aircraft. And that brought closure, helped to bring closure to his family, who had been just kind of wondering what happened over the last 17 years and what became of their son, their brother, their loved one. So it's it's very important to get both law enforcement and family members involved in the decision making process whenever it comes to human remain recovery.
Yeah, and it's made all the more real to me every story I go through when you realize, yes, the shipwrecks are incredible and the story and the history behind it, but then you learn a lot of people's ultimately a lot of times last moments, and you kind of relive those moments in your head as best you can, like, oh, you went down during this horrible blizzard out in Lake Michigan, and this person, who knows what was going through their mind? Like, am I gonna be remembered? What my family gonna know what happened to me? And that's why I try to handle each and every story as, um, respectfully, delicately, but also I do think it should be talked about. It should be, brought to people so that these are not nameless, faceless for all of time. Like, these are your brother, your sister, your grandfather, your uncle. Like, it's and I think that's an important thing that should be talked about, and that's why I was curious with you on that because it brings closure for family. I think that's
Right.
important.
No, yeah, absolutely. And even if a wreck involves no fatalities, it's a pretty traumatic experience in people's lives. And when I was a little kid, I remember my dad getting in a little fender bender, and that it sticks with me. It's 50 years later. I'm still can envision that day and that moment. And even though nobody got hurt, there was minimal damage to the car. It was still an event, a pretty traumatic event. And I can't imagine going down on an aircraft or a ship and surviving through that you don't carry that with you forevermore, right? And then when there is loss of life, it becomes even much more traumatic to not only the people that experience it, but their family members and even the descendants of their family members and friends. This idea of grief and closure gets passed down generations. And I often work with folks that have a great grandfather or a great uncle or somebody in their family that they never met, but they want to know what happened to him. Why is he out there? What happened to his airplane? What happened to his ship? Is he findable? Is he able to come home? Those kinds of things, and it does get passed down generations.
Yeah, no, it's I love that. That was again a part of the Fitz story, knowing the 29 that they obviously they're still family members alive today, and just to be able to retell that, but then also the thousands of others as well, equally just as, in my opinion, just as important as the Fitz. But like you're saying, even if a wreck or aircraft didn't necessarily lose somebody, that's wow, to survive that, it's incredible, and I don't think the average everyday Joe thinks about that, at least when it comes to this. That's something I like to bring importance to this, is like, okay, maybe people didn't lose their lives on this, but, like, put yourself in that situation at least.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So it could be pretty crazy. But that all said, going kind of removing the people a little bit out of this, some of these wreck sites are incredibly important historically because they are extremely unique, sometimes one of a kind. They've been affiliated with, pretty important groups of people, like the Tuskegee Airmen, for example. And every one of them has a story to tell. There were people that made these things, people that operated these things, people that went down in the lake with these things, and there's just an untold number of stories that you can learn just by doing research, just by understanding what you're looking at, by going out finding a wreck site and bringing that story to today, and it's a pretty cool part of my job, I think, is just kind of being able to kind of suss out those stories. And every one of them has a story, of the airplanes. There are 1,200 airplanes. There are 1,400 something fatalities. There are over 1,000 survivors of those craft. And they're all people, and they all are different. They all have their different lives and their different perspectives and their different accounts of that incident that results in a pile of aluminum that's now laying on the lake floor, and then, so it's not just a pile of aluminum. This is a place where somebody maybe died. It's where somebody's dreams may have ended or began. It's a life changer in a lot of times, and to be able to connect, especially with the family members or the people that were directly involved in it or their descendants, is really, really a cool process in all of this. And in the Tuskegee airplane, we were Frank Moody, Lieutenant Frank Moody was the pilot. And I found through basic genealogical research that he had two sisters and he had a nephew. The nephew's still living, Eric Bryant. And in 2021, we were able to have Eric Bryant and his family come out and brought him out over the wreck site, showed him artifacts, and then put an ROV, or a remotely operated underwater robot, down to the wreck. And he was able to see his uncle's wreck site personally for the first time. And it was an extremely powerful moment, for him to connect this guy who never met his uncle because he was born after his uncle died here in Lake Huron. But it was a powerful moment to see that family connection, to see his emotions, to hear his stories that his grandmother and his mother passed down about his uncle. And it was really, really an honor to do that.
How is that, that's incredible. How has that affected you? Like, has that just made it all the more real for you being able to experience these, and this is why you're doing what you do?
Yeah, it made it really real. I've worked on as an archaeologist for over 40 years, and I've worked on shipwrecks since about 1990. And most of the time, and especially young in my career, I was fascinated with the wrecks. And I have anthropology degree, so I understand that it's all about the people, right? But I was more interested, I think, in the technology of it all. If this gear rotates this way, what does this one over here do? And why did they put a white oak plank here if everything is, red pine, or vice versa? Or why did the fastener pattern get interrupted like that? And so I was thinking of those kinds of questions as I'm experiencing and documenting these wreck sites. And then when I started working on airplanes about 12 or 14 years ago, uh, it weirdly changed and it became more of a focus on people, which is ironic because airplanes are more mass produced, like they're an assembly line kind of thing. And a P-39 Airacobra, there were, I don't know, over 10,000 of them built, and they all looked kind of the same. There were varieties and such, and they changed a little bit depending on what they were used for and who operated them. But there was nothing particularly special about the airplane. But the pilot became important, and his life and his story and why he was there and what he was going through, and especially these black aviators in World War II that were going through an amazing amount of conflict here in the U.S. and abroad. They were fighting two wars simultaneously against racism and segregation here in the country, and against Axis powers in Europe. And it became it became for me much more of a focus for the person and what they were doing and what they were experiencing, and the artifacts that were around them were just tools and objects that they were handling, that they were exposed to at the time. So we conducted through Alpena Community College an archaeological field school on a KC-135 crash site in the woods south of Alpena, Michigan. And there's a lot of aluminum still in the woods there. And I had a bunch of students. There were, I think, 9 or 10 students, co-eds, and we were just mapping debris. So we were mapping bits and pieces of aluminum. And there was a lot of complaining about poison ivy and ticks and mosquitoes and, those kinds of things as you are in the northern woods here. Um, and they were just mapping debris. They were mapping pieces of aluminum. and they didn't really think of it like they thought of it like I did shipwrecks originally. And then the last day of the field school, we had one of the first responders that arrived at that wreck site back in the 1970s, and he came out and walked through the woods with us, and he pointed out where he found this person, where he saw this object, where he saw this other deceased person, that kind of thing. And it became really real to the students, just like that. And so it became important. The job that they were doing now wasn't just mapping a bunch of junk that's out in the woods and getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. It became something, a place that was important to document and important to understand the tragedy that occurred there, and to help uh, protect it through thorough documentation. So it was a neat transition to be able to witness.
That's incredible. I love that. That's a huge passion of mine. I love getting the next generation excited about stuff like this because there's a plethora of different um, things that you can get involved with it. There's so many different sides to this. And I guess I have a two-parter question. Knowing that, are you hopeful for this next generation coming up, like more of the youth getting involved with all these different facets of shipwreck and aviation and finding stuff? And I guess the second part is, at least for you in your position, do you see a growth in that? Do you see that growing towards more? Because I don't want it to age out. I don't want any of this to age out. I want things to keep us going.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think the answer to it, I probably will change every other time I'm asked that question. And so sometimes I have a lot of faith, and sometimes I have less faith in the idea that this is going to carry on. A lot of museums, a lot of archaeological societies are dwindling, they're aging out, and we're not getting young people involved. That said, I was just at these yearly meetings in Lansing the last couple of days, and there were tons of young people there, and so it's like it felt great, and they're bringing not just that sort of young enthusiasm, but they're bringing the ability to do research that I could have never done in my early 20s because I didn't even know what a computer was back then. Certainly didn't have the internet and the resources that are available. We didn't have the technologies that you utilize to be able to see through the ground, to see through the water column, to see under the ground. This is all kind of relatively new stuff. It's been in the works for many generations, but its application in archaeology is really, really exciting. And these younger folks are really good at that, and they're going to be able to study these sites in a much less intrusive way than I was accustomed to. When I cut my teeth in archaeology, it meant dig. It meant dig it all up and bring it all in the lab, clean it, study it, analyze it, whatever. And now it's much more of a non-invasive kind of approach to archaeological study, and where you're looking at either select, targeting of a site, or select excavation of a site, or using remote technologies to be able to see the site better underground without disturbing it whatsoever. And that was science fiction when I was in my 20s as an undergraduate. So it's pretty exciting to kind of to see these next generations. It might not be as big as quantity wise, but I think that the quality of the research and their ability is going to be just through the roof.
That's positive. That's good. I like that, and that's why I like having. I appreciate you coming on here. I had Brendan Baylid on a while ago. He's got his thing through Wisconsin that he was very positive that he takes kids out like through a program. He can bring students out. They do stuff with the Wisconsin area. I love I love supporting Brother Rick because I think his lectures and his presentations are very important because, like you said, it may not be quantity, but the quality is there. When you get the person that is they really appreciate and understand the heart of this and it sticks with them and they that ain't gonna change. I like that. I like quality over quantity, and um, that's relieving because I think this is a fascinating thing. I at least would hope it's taught more in schools. I would love Michigan maritime history. I think needs desperately to be taught in schools as well, because there's so much more of an appreciation once it is that, hey, the Great Lakes State is not just cherries, wine, football, and out in Grand Haven. It's so much more than just that.
Yeah. Michigan wouldn't be Michigan if it wasn't for the four surrounding Great Lakes. I mean, it's very important through the history and continues to be important today for commerce, for the economy, for recreation, that sort of thing. So it is important to know our past, to know our heritage here, to help preserve it, and and to use that really as a springboard even to protect the Great Lakes. This is the biggest freshwater supply on the planet, and we really need to take care of it and appreciate it as such. And right now we got a big mess up here in northern Michigan with flooding and snow melt and all of the stuff that the climate is going crazy with, and it's going to affect these submerged cultural resources. It's digging stuff out of the beaches. It's covering stuff out in the nearshore. So everything that we do has an effect and impact on our surroundings, obviously, and that includes our historic and our cultural and archaeological surroundings. And so it is important to understand it and to take whatever steps are necessary to help preserve it.
Yeah. That's absolutely. Another question that you just brought to my mind, you had touched on museums a few moments ago. Do you also think that especially with spring coming here and everything's going to start opening up pretty quickly here, do you see the museums like maybe I don't if you have much with Duluth with the Meteor and the Irwin out in Duluth, or at least the Valley Camp in Sault Ste. Marie, or even what you're involved with? Do you see a growth in interest for the museums as well to keep this too?
Well, I certainly hope so. There are a whole bunch of maritime focused museums across the Great Lakes here in Michigan and elsewhere. And then there are a lot of local historical societies and smaller museums that have a big focus on maritime endeavors, particularly those on the coast, but even inland waterways and such have these things. There are more and more academic institutions around Michigan and around the Great Lakes that are starting to talk about maritime heritage and underwater archaeology in particular. That didn't exist a generation ago. So I like to think that there is growth and a lot of potential for that. Some of these museums tell amazing stories. They have incredible collections of materials. There are archives here in Alpena and Bowling Green and other places around the Great Lakes that have so much information on all of the vessels, particularly the ships themselves, whether or not they sank. That is out there and available for study. We have giant artifact collections that are managed by the state of Michigan. I have about 4,000 artifacts that came off of shipwrecks or from maritime collections that are largely unstudied. So there's a great potential for continuing research, continuing museum exhibition, traveling shows, the whole works. Yeah. So yeah, I see growth for sure.
Okay, very good. That's another relieving thing. I want to bring attention for those, because as much as the stories are cool and everything, and each new video, like, oh, the SS Argus, the John B. Cowell, the LR Doty, whatever. Hey, you can also enjoy this introduction video. Go to the museum. Go support these historical societies. Go support the people that go and do this. That's what I want. I want as well for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And not only visit, but get involved.
Yes.
They're always looking for help. They're always looking for volunteers. A lot of times, my whole career, every time I volunteered for something, I ended up getting paid ultimately to work there. And it's a great step in the right direction. It's great experience. It's a great place to network and to meet folks that have similar interests, that have a lot of knowledge about these topics that they can pass on, because so much of it right now, especially in older generations, is institutional knowledge that's not being published, that's not being written down very well. And when you lose a historian that's been around for generations here, a lot of times you lose all the information that they had with them, and it's unfortunate. So, but they love to pass it down, and there's always that opportunity to work in these historical societies, to volunteer in museums, to get involved in public programming, that sort of thing. And there are more and more folks like Rick Mixter that go around Michigan and the Great Lakes, and they bring these stories to small communities and large communities alike. And So that's pretty exciting, and it's getting more and more people aware of their connection. Sometimes they don't even know. When I first met Eric Bryant, he knew very little about the aircraft that his uncle was flying and training in and ultimately died in. He didn't know that part of the story. He knew the stories that his mom and his grandmother told him, but to be able to help him learn about his own history, his own family's history, was is really really cool. And it motivated him to go out and do more research, to find more photographs, to find more people that knew his uncle directly, that kind of thing. So it's all related. And again, it's just one little tiny thing, like seeing a shipwreck or seeing an artifact, that ultimately just sort of, like the Fitzgerald did for you, it opens up everything else. And you never stop learning, and you never start seeking these kinds of stories and this information that's out there, and it's so prevalent, but it's so just not told very well right now. So it's up to us, I guess, to keep that ball moving and to pass it on to next generations to keep those stories alive.
And that's why I appreciate each and every one of you guys that come on here and interview. I like to archive these and bring that information to people. Okay, if they can find it through YouTube and these interviews, then let's keep it rolling. Let's keep the interest going. And I appreciate you coming on here and sharing with us and giving. I learned something new. I learned multiple things new each and every person that comes on. And again, I honestly, I don't think I give Brother Rick enough credit, but he really opened the door for a lot of this. He introduced me to many people, and all these people are amazing, and they're I haven't met a single person who isn't willing or wanting to share with it. And like you yourself, uh, it's invaluable. I love it, and uh, it's just another thing why I do what I do. And I do what I do to pay the bills, but my dream is to be involved with something within uh, shipwrecks or artifact, whatever. I could not care less. But a dream of mine, yeah, is to really get involved doing something like that. And if this can be a springboard into that, then hoorah! I'm all for it.
No, that's awesome.